consulting and advisory firm that specializes in technical diligence, product roadmaps, and business models for mobility topics. He is currently advising several different types of clients, including investors and corporations, as well as a lot of companies that are adjacent to that in mobility and supplier industries. Dr. Beiker is a lecturer at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University, and he also has really, Sven, I think you said 20 years of experience in this area. So we're really looking for your wisdom around this view of mobility, and also given that we're here in the Midwest, you are on the left coast. I'm thinking you're going to have a little bit of a different perspective on some of these issues. So without further ado, Dr. Sven Beiker.
Thanks very much for the welcome, and thanks, Alan, for inviting me and the nice intro. It's actually 23 years, 2 days from today, so May 2nd. I walked into BMW's Advanced Engineering Center, sitting down there, and I literally said, okay, I'm sitting on this chair at BMW Advanced Engineering, and from here I'm going to retire. All right, it didn't happen, at least I haven't retired yet, and I'm not in Munich anymore. But BMW brought me to Silicon Valley now 15 years ago, and actually, it was not in Silicon Valley that I was really getting interested in the future of mobility. Believe it or not, it was in this area, because from 2006 until 2008, I worked with BMW and Daimler Chrysler and GM on the two-mode hybrid in Troy, Michigan. And there was definitely a very special time. It was mentioned in some of the presentations this morning. When oil price went up, people started buying Priuses. There was a lot of talk about peak oil. It was a little bit like, really? Will people go on and buy cars forever, or is it just changing? And I will say, living in the Detroit area at that time, I found depressingly inspiring. Really more inspiring than depressing, because I kept working on these topics. And what my wife and I wanted going back to California then actually was possible, because I left BMW for Stanford University, and I'm still good friends with everyone at BMW, and so therefore I'm really excited to bring my view of the mobility world here to the session. I was asked to share a view of Silicon Valley. There's not just one view in Silicon Valley. There are people who are genius. There are people who are naive, there are people who are bold, people who are scared. And so I'm bringing my own view, and we actually want to focus more on the discussion afterwards than on my slides. So therefore, let me dive into it. But what I found interesting, that the first two acronyms here, ACES and CASE, have not been mentioned today at all. And I thought everybody would be talking about it. ACES being autonomous, connected, electric, and shared, and CASE being connected, autonomous, shared, and electric. But no one's using this yet. I don't know if that's a Silicon Valley term. I know that CASE is preferred by Daimler, Mercedes-Benz. ACES, I think, is preferred more by the startup world. But that's what we always talk about, and also what I like to talk about just at the beginning of the talk, very, very briefly, is this picture here on the left, which is, on the one hand, an open road where it goes left, goes right. We don't really know if it goes straight into the future. You don't even know if there's a future behind this last turn. And if you look at it, people see different things in it. Some say, oh, not a whole lot of infrastructure here for autonomous driving. Others say, wait a minute, there's great lane markings and GPS coverage. That's fantastic. Some say, it's a great road to drive on. Others might say, it will take forever until an Uber picks you up here. So really, mobility is many different things. And so therefore, I'm happy to share my thinking. Just to set a little bit the baseline, because I don't know too many in the room, I need to say. I hope we can change this throughout the afternoons. And therefore I assume not everyone is familiar with me. So let's say what others say about the stuff that I share. Some call it pessimistic. Someone said when I wrote a op-ed for MIT Technology Review, there's nothing but a bunch of fear mongering in this piece. I had to look up fear mongering, I think that's the right pronunciation, but Horta 1212 probably wanted to make a point there. Just about months ago, when I presented on electric vehicles, I was called biased towards traditional auto. It's getting better, so trust me. And then when the Canadian Broadcast Corporation interviewed me about a year ago on autonomous vehicles, the reporter from Canada said, well, but Elon Musk said by the end of 2017 they're going to drive autonomously from LA to New York City. And I said, well, I guess then Elon Musk doesn't agree with me. So much about just one perspective from Silicon Valley. And then when I discussed with my colleagues at McKinsey, where I used to be for 2.5 years before I started my own consulting firm, they said, well, but Google is really close now. Well, probably they're close. And then my dear students at Stanford, at the business school, who spend a little bit more time with me, then say that really helps them to understand the industry better. And I think that is really important, especially in Silicon Valley, which I think here in the Midwest we really appreciate. It does take some time, some effort, and also some openness to actually understand the automotive industry. It's not just you have a great idea, you ship it to the assembly line, and then you put it on whatever, 100,000, 1 million vehicles, and it just magically works. It's not just like shipping software. And actually, sometimes I'm being called too optimistic. It was about half a year ago when I gave a talk at Autonomous Drive Tech in Detroit, when I shared my perspective, and someone then later on anonymously said, a little bit too optimistic. And again, my students at the business school, that it challenges them to think harder about their basic ideas. The basic idea is basically saying, well, it's all ready, and we will have our autonomous vehicles soon. Okay, what about Silicon Valley? It's actually a pretty cool place. If you look at it from above, you see many things. You might find the winner of the first autonomous vehicle competition. We talked about Boss from Carnegie Mellon a little bit earlier. We obviously had the Stanford vehicle. I call them just the pioneer in electric premium vehicles. I don't put company logos there. A visionary in automated vehicles, but also the disruptor. I think the disruption is really in order in e-hailing or ride-sharing. But also, and I say this here with pride in Detroit, the inventor of the automobile, Mercedes-Benz, certainly has offices there as well. And then you have all these other OEMs, you have all these startups, and then certainly you have maybe the glue that holds it all together, all the investors that are there on Center Road. They're not really that outgoing, they like to cling together. A little bit more in one area. And of course you have me with my little company right in the middle. Who would have thought? All right, but if we take a little bit closer perspective on the map, we certainly have all the company, all the household names of Silicon Valley players that you expect. But the nice thing about this is that there's actually quite a few gaps in between those household names in Silicon Valley. And that fills up quite nicely with the automotive world. If you only were to look at the automotive companies here, you certainly find the big three from Detroit, you find the big three from Germany, you find the big three from Japan. You basically find every car company under the sun, all the major suppliers as well, and also quite a few services. And this is really what keeps me there, because I think it's hard to find another place on the planet where you find this concentration of companies. Maybe not concentration of engineers and automotive people, but really concentration of companies in a relatively small area. And that makes it so exciting that all of this is really working together one way or another to really look at the future of the automobile. And we get a lot of headlines, and quite often it's said, well, is Silicon Valley the new Detroit? And it's certainly a question that one can ask, especially having lived in the Detroit area. I asked, what does it mean, the new Detroit? And does actually Silicon Valley want to be the new Detroit? And at the very beginning of the session today, it was asked like, oh, Silicon Valley is going after the automotive industry, which I would not quite frame that way, and I will explain a little bit later why. But if you just skim through these headlines, you certainly find quite a few that look probably very familiar to you. Maybe also a few old friends. If you look at the second from the top on the very right, Uber has apparently ordered 10 billion worth of Mercedes S-Classes sedans. So when I looked at this slide again, I was like, yeah, there was a headline 2 years ago. Well, whatever happened to this, right? And then also you find these things like, what was the other one I wanted to point out? Obviously you find these evaluations more than GM at some point. And then, yeah, it's the second from the bottom on the right. Google is start building its own self-driving car. There was certainly something that was in 2014, I believe, when it was like, oh, now Google is coming out with a car. Which then in the end, Roush, not too far from here, built, I think, in the order of 100 vehicles or something like this. And that really tells us something. It's a very fast-paced environment. Quite frankly, sometimes way too fast for me. And I'm like, I really have enough of this Silicon Valley. We have to change the world, we have to disrupt everything. But it certainly brings a lot forward. And Silicon Valley for sure has brought a lot forward. So if we just look here at, oops, no, the car comes later. If we just look at the different phases here in Silicon Valley, you can argue it goes up in steps, started somewhat after World War II, aerospace and defense. For instance, actually, where the Detroit car companies came as well. What started as Ford Space or Ford Aerospace later on became Space Systems Loral. As much as I understand, GM had quite some input what later became Lockheed Martin. But it was not aerospace and defense forever. It was then like, okay, what about these new silicon things, these microchips? What about personal computers? What about the internet, social media? And obviously, right now, we have a lot about artificial intelligence, and this is where the automobile fits in. What's really important to me to show on this slide, that things don't last very long in Silicon Valley. I would not really bet on something that Silicon Valley has a huge interest in mobility by the time when everything autonomous, connected, electric, and shared is fully deployed. I could very well imagine that it's then something else. If I knew what it actually is, the next big thing, I think I'd still be here, but I might be overall in a different business. Can be implementable, it's longevity, maybe it's space again, and we come full circle with aerospace and defense again. But what is all this Silicon Valley about anyways? What are people really interested in? And it's really something that many would agree, it's about something new, big, and good. Okay, that's probably what was expected. But then to change the world, and the interesting thing, what I really find repeatedly, it does not necessarily start with a business model. Sure, when you want to go to Center Road and talk to the VC firms, you better have a business plan in your back pocket. But it's really how do you address a large number of people. And I just always get back to this experience that I had when we took executives from Detroit, Stuttgart, and Yokohama to a meeting at Android Auto. And we discussed Android Auto, operating system for media, navigation system in the car, and that Google, the Android people, would really like to scale this up. And we were discussing, and then the auto people asked, so what's your business model? How do you make money with this? The operating system is free, right? Well, we're not really approaching it from that angle, how we make money with it. Well, you guys are in a fortunate situation. But they basically say, well, look, we want to reach as many people as possible. So it's not so much, can we really start with something where we have maybe 1 million customers. 1 million would be considered small. We have 1 million customers and that it works. And then how do we get to 2 million and maybe 2.5 million? It's really like, how do we reach 100 million people, maybe 1 billion people? Because that cannot be a bad thing. Well, as a European and really thinking about all this data privacy and such, like, well, many people and you have the responsibility, maybe not a bad thing, but it might be a very tough thing. But it's certainly this thinking where you see back to this new big and good that you really want to understand and like, well, if Silicon Valley goes after something, it's not like we want to crush their business model. It's not really like we want to be better than who's working in Detroit or Stuttgart, Wolfsburg or whatever. It's really, does it fit in this thing? And that's unfortunately the largest resolution picture that I could find. It's from Google X. This is why the X is there in the middle, from Astro Teller, the captain of moonshots at Google X, where they say, well, if huge problem, breakthrough technology, and radical solution overlap, then we go after it. And that's really what it is. And so therefore, the incremental improvement, which I, as an automotive engineer, really appreciate, because we need to go through these incremental improvements in the automobile world. And Silicon Valley says, someone else is working on it. We really want to go after the big challenges. And if Silicon Valley really thinks big, this is what they come up with. I know they're not really working on the Firefly vehicle anymore, but in the end, that's what they came up with. In the end, again, designed, engineered, and manufactured at Roush, here just a little bit south near Dearborn. But the big thinking is really what matters. If you look at these numbers, close to 600 billion in losses through accidents in the United States. People stuck in traffic, 42 hours average every year, which equates, depends who you ask, one full work week. But also the more philanthropic side on the right, really about the elderly, where you find that close to 80% of seniors age 69 and older live in car-dependent communities. And we had earlier these conversations on how do we build our cities that they are more livable. And I would flip this around, that we should not forget not everybody can drive. 3 million people age 40 and older are blind and have low vision, therefore cannot use the car. So what we are trying to do here is this, whatever you want to call it, romantic depiction of traffic in the city, or if you want to call it a mess or congestion or whatever. But it causes a lot of problems, and those we need to address. And that's just a slightly different way of slicing and dicing the externalities of mobility. The fatalities on a global level, 1.2 million, and typically referenced by the United Nations. And gridlock, there's a slightly different numbers, depends which cities you're looking at. But you're getting the point, and I guess we all agree, as great as mobility is, it comes at a price. And as a society for now, we said, well, that's the price we got to pay, but hopefully we can do better. And then we come up with these things, and this is where the CASE or ACES or whatever you want to call it, the autonomous, connected, electric, and shared comes in. So far, so good. And just over lunch, I had a discussion, and I'm hoping we will continue this discussion later on. Because my take on this is as follows. As great as this relation between the picture on the left and the picture on the right is, my personal view is, very often what we are doing at the moment looks more like this, which is we're playing in sandboxes. We have fantastic autonomous driving pilots in a very confined area, in an almost sanitized area, in a well-guarded area, same as a sandbox should be. Even for sharing, if you want to look at it, we have these pockets. Yes, it's big in New York City, it's big in San Francisco. But when I wanted to call an Uber today from Ann Arbor downtown to here, it would take 17 minutes to get an Uber to my hotel, which tells us it's not really available at scale as we would like it to be, which we discussed also quite a bit this morning. And also in electrification, we keep citing these numbers over and over again for how long basically electric vehicles, including hybrids obviously, have been around, and that it's hard to get beyond 2% market share. And also in connectivity, if we look at this. Yes, just here, not far from this very location, we've had the vehicle-to-vehicle communication pilots work very well. Do we have it in our cars that we're purchasing today? Not really. So how do we get from this great idea to this really very hopeful future? How do we get through the sandbox? And my take on this is infrastructure. That's really what we need. We really need the infrastructure to make all this happen. So let's take a closer look what infrastructure actually means for mobility. And this is something I can tell you, certainly not everyone in Silicon Valley agrees with me. Because in Silicon Valley, the thinking is, oh, infrastructure takes way too long. We have to do it on our own. It has to be all self-contained. We cannot wait until there's like maybe a vehicle-to-vehicle communication setting out in public. Can't wait that long. We cannot wait until the public players put out an electric vehicle charging network. We do our own, obviously. So, but all the things that we need, obviously infrastructure starts with a road infrastructure. We need to look at traffic signs. Then what is really important, what I find is an intermodal approach to transportation. We had earlier a little bit of a discussion. Yeah, sure, it's great if I get in my Uber and then maybe I get on a train or a bus or something like this, but how does all of this work together? I think this is really something where, certainly with the power of a smartphone app, we can get much, much better and therefore get to a better mobility system. The different fuel supply systems, we talk a lot about, obviously, gasoline, diesel, and electrification for a reason. But we should also not forget hydrogen seems to be the ultimate goal, but really implementing a hydrogen infrastructure, this is just where we see it might take a lot longer. And also somewhat in between, which is totally possible today, natural gas. What happened to natural gas? Seems to be a great carrier of energy. Seems to be burning much cleaner and is better regarding greenhouse gas emissions. But implementing an infrastructure, that is the hard part. Which gas station operator would take out one pump that's being used, what, 15 times an hour and put in a natural gas pump? It's maybe used twice a day. Not a great business case. Others are some sort of traffic operators or online services. OnStar was mentioned this morning, certainly one of the pioneers in this field. Communication infrastructure in general, whether it's cellular communication or others. Satellite navigation systems, satellite communication. But what we should also not forget, things go wrong, and certainly part of the infrastructure is also a rescue system, which changes to some extent for electric vehicles. As much as I know, when there's really a heavy accident with an electric vehicle, that sometimes the first responders really wonder, oh, how do we get into this vehicle? So there's one example. And there might also be something for automated vehicles where we need to see how the general infrastructure changes. So if we want to look at this and really take a more systematic approach at infrastructure, if we take the ACES or the autonomous connected electrification and sharing, what I put as commoditization there at the end, and then go one by one, infrastructure really comes in three forms in my mind. At least it's a relatively good way of structuring it. It's to build infrastructure, really what do we need to do to our city, concrete and tarmac and metal. The technical infrastructure, what do we need to deploy on top of this to make it happen. And let's not forget the legal infrastructure. And what we see really that for all of these, there are examples. It's not really something where we say, oh, we need the infrastructure for charging and we're done. So it's really a lot that needs to happen here. And maybe to just pick some of them, for automation, for instance, we really need infrastructure, I would say, in all three of them. Because it might start with something where we say a special lane on a highway where automated vehicles can operate. On that special highway lane, maybe where we have a certain communication standard where we say, well, okay, even if you are not in your level 4 automated vehicle, as long as you broadcast your position and communicate with the other vehicles, you can get in. And the moment we say, as long as you do this or that, obviously it becomes a legal thing. Certainly there's a state-by-state regulation for automated vehicles. Certainly that's very important what NHTSA is doing. But we should not forget that it's very often on a municipal, maybe on a certain highway level, where it becomes something, okay, we allow this certain test pilot, or we allow these vehicles to operate. You can see for yourself, and some of it should be self-explanatory, so therefore I just want to jump to the one on the very right, commoditization or sharing, where, sure, I wanted to make this page complete, so I said, well, you cannot leave a blank in there, so you need to come up with something, infrastructure for sharing. And the more I thought about it, it really was something. So in my consulting work, we actually saw quite often at airports. At airports, it's really becoming a mess with all these ride-hailing vehicles showing up. And therefore, airports need to regulate, obviously, where can those vehicles be staged? How do you control the access to the airport? And where can you actually get into the vehicle and out of the vehicle? So parking and staging really becomes pretty important. But also then the whole infrastructure of automated scheduling and pricing and all of this. Certainly Uber and Lyft would not be possible without cellular communication, and they might even get better through even better networks, who knows. But certainly the operating permission is a very important one. So there again, you see the build, the technical and the legal infrastructure. That's important for all of them. Okay, that's all good. We know this. We can do it. Silicon Valley says, well, it takes way too long. Others say, okay, let's get behind it. But there's something in between, which is, well, infrastructure costs money. And if you look at this study here from the American Society of Civil Engineers, they're looking at different sectors of infrastructure. The top one is the one that's of interest here to us, which is the surface transportation. And all the way to the right, basically, the whole orange part is how much infrastructure would be required by 2025, which is for road transportation, mostly to fill potholes and make sure that bridges don't collapse, and do a little bit of new construction and hopefully have good lane markings on the road. But it does not really include everything that we had on the previous slide. But the blue part is that what is actually funded. And the little bubbles there, the 54, 19, 27, and so on, that is actually the percentage how big the funding gap is. That means the road infrastructure is only half funded with more or less the existing demand. So how do we put up all these additional needs that I hypothesized on the previous slide for communication and special lanes and such for these new kinds of mobility solutions? Really, how do we get out of the sandbox? This is where it really requires, in the end, obviously, public-private partnerships, and where we also need to move forward little by little, because we don't want to deploy an infrastructure today that by the time that the vehicles are there is already outdated. But let's get a little bit more positive here. If all of this works out, then we should not think of it just as an automobile. Automobile 2.0, 3.0, what have you. It really becomes something much bigger. And this is maybe now the German Silicon Valley mixed up in me that got carried away when I actually found this paper. It's referenced down here from Michael Porter. Michael Porter at Harvard Business School, probably familiar to many of you, Porter 5 Forces, often referenced even in the Stanford Business School class. But he also wrote a very interesting, I think very important other paper. He wrote many papers, but the one that I specifically like and therefore put in a little framework here is the system of systems. And he had it for a slightly different example, but I tweaked it so that it actually fits our purpose, which was mentioned earlier today. A car is a car is a car. Okay, fine. Let's say the product is a vehicle. Now it becomes a smart vehicle, a smart product that can, to some extent, drive itself, an automated vehicle. Now we are adding the smart connected part to it, and this is really where Michael Porter talks a lot about the smart connected product and what it enables. So it's basically the automated and connected vehicle, the AC in the ACES or CASE or what have you. But now we see already, now that it can drive itself and connects with others, that it really becomes part of a larger transportation system. And maybe even the drones fit in there to some extent. On my last slide, which is the next one, we'll go back to the drones a little bit. But there we see, because the vehicle is now exchanging all this information and can be controlled in an automated fashion, it really becomes part of the larger transportation ecosystem. Once we achieve this, and the transportation ecosystem then connects with everything else, then we really see that the system of system is really a situation where we have many opportunities to make transportation of people and goods more efficient, safer, and where I think we don't really grasp what it is going to be after all. I mean, obviously I just picked a few examples here from e-commerce, Of course, these days you have to throw in some blockchain and things like that. But this is really my point, that many of us, including me, we're making a mistake that we are extrapolating too much. So we just see something, we say, aha, now I know what the future is. I'm making this mistake. And very often it appears to me that we are doing something like back in the year 2000, okay? Where you had heard of something like the internet probably, and maybe something we knew what a bookstore is. Had we extrapolated what Amazon was going to be when we first heard about them in the year 2000, sure, Amazon, that's books and internet. Easy, you buy books on the internet. So what it can become, I think that is really interesting. And this is really where we see, as the automobile is becoming automated and connected, it really becomes part of this system of systems. Now, I started with Silicon Valley, and I want to close with a slightly larger perspective, which is the San Francisco Bay Area, which is my own personal hypothesis how automated driving might unfold in the San Francisco Bay Area. You can call this science fiction, you can call this speculative, but I came up with this slide because too often was I in discussions when I was called a pessimist, and the next moment I was called an optimist. I was like, are we then talking about the same thing? And once I've had this together, people said, well, maybe. It's a starting point for a discussion. So I'm going to share this with you, and I'm really happy to get your questions, your remarks, your better vision afterwards. The early phase. So I assume quite some of you are familiar with the San Francisco Bay Area. I tried the best of my PowerPoint skills to draw this map myself. So 2020, early deployment phase. I assume that we will have these pilot shuttle services in a few selected cities. I would assume, for obvious reasons, it's Mountain View, and I would think it's San Jose and not San Francisco, just because San Jose is actually, in my observation, more open to trying those new things. Also brags itself as the center of Silicon Valley. So it would look nice in San Jose to have these automated shuttle services that were described quite a bit earlier today. You see the I-5 corridor there on the right, which is the Central Valley, obviously, in California. So this is not to scale, but it's important actually to talk about trucks. And we had commercial vehicles being mentioned earlier this morning, so it's not just so much about our vehicles that we hold very dear to our hearts and that we want to be self-driving. Really, in trucking and commercial vehicle operations, there's a lot in the business case that can be done. And it's conceivable, I think, that by 2020 we might have automated platoons, so trucks that are basically wirelessly tethered together, that they might be on some routes on, or route segments on I-5. And that's what I call the early phase. Okay, 2025, the growth phase. I think then, once we figured out, oh, these actually work, these shuttle services. And I know shuttle services are already out today, but it's pilots in my mind. When I want to write them, most of them I cannot. I've been on some of them, but for now it's very often pilots. But by 2025 it might spread out, and maybe then we're getting to San Francisco, maybe also to my now hometown Palo Alto, which always is a little bit more careful. Ooh, can we do this, and what does it really mean? Sometimes really for good reasons to do this. I think also 2025 we might see level 4 express lanes on the freeways, where we see a lot today automated tolling, where we have some infrastructure to communicate with the vehicles, and that this might then be one of the building blocks for automated vehicles. And also delivery vans that I could imagine around San Jose. Why San Jose? Because San Jose is the major hub for the Bay Area for freight, for air freight, air cargo. Within the United States, so FedEx and UPS operate a lot of their flights out of San Jose. And for reasons that I had earlier in the 2020 scenario, I can imagine that quite some of this happens. The mainstream phase, 2030. So more of these L4 lanes. So once we figure out this works, we basically spread it out even further. And then maybe we will have some of these shuttles that can actually take me from my house in Palo Alto all the way to the San Francisco, San Jose airport. Because then we get more certainty that this actually works. And the same also with these delivery services. It has to build on one another, and then we figure out, let's deploy it more broadly. Now the question is, when will we have this really unlimited automated driving? And this is what journalists, reporters, media people always like to ask. When will we have it? I always ask, well, what do you mean by it? But usually they ask for the level 5 automated vehicle. That is the magic push of the button, where I could even get in a car here in Ann Arbor, push a button, and wake up in Palo Alto, maybe tomorrow afternoon or something like that. That will take a long time. In my mind, really, for all these building blocks that we need from infrastructure, but also all the learning that we need to do. And over the last 2 months, tragically, we learned. Tragically, we saw that some things are not as ready as we think. Tragically, we also saw that the capabilities of the currently available technology is overestimated. So therefore, we need to go through all these steps, but it will take time. And I think this is one hypothesis what it might look like. And I'm open, obviously, for your questions and comments, what you think this should be like. But for now, this is what I wanted to share. Thanks for your attention, and let's dive into the discussion.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay, yes.
Yeah. So, I teach here at the university. We're here for different reasons. I'm motivated by the problem and challenge of climate change, not mobility per se. And when I hear and read about new mobility, I see, like everybody else, nightmare scenarios and wonderful scenarios that we don't know. And I see oil and gas companies starting to play with renewable energy, and I see car companies starting to invest in shared driving, shared vehicles, and so on. But in the end, wouldn't it be a little naive for us to assume that oil and gas companies don't want to sell fuel in the end, and car companies in the end don't want to sell cars? Maybe shared cars, maybe autonomous, maybe electric, but in the end they're driven by that, and they have huge lobbies. So why would we not be worried?
Yeah. Well, I didn't say don't be worried. And don't expect for me to explain the oil and car companies at a general scale. But I will say, I mean, these companies are after all not charity. That's what it is. I mean, it's a business that provides for many people who work there, and it's a business that is also committed to shareholder value. So, but I do take note for both of these camps, and I want to put it in separate buckets. I do take note of the gas and oil companies, the energy providers, that my observation is they are seriously looking at alternatives and the future so that they are ready to provide it once there's demand. That doesn't mean that they are driving it, but that they are working on it to actually provide it, hydrogen. And there's quite a few, as much as I understand, oil companies invested in battery technologies as well. And for the car companies, I really applaud the car companies. We obviously heard about Maven earlier today and Chariot. And I think on the German side, the Car2Go and Reach Now examples from Daimler and BMW are pretty good examples. That the car companies are trying to figure out what can be new mobility solutions. And I don't discuss often with energy companies, but I discuss basically every day with car companies. And I find that it's sincere when the car companies say, it might be that we will be selling fewer vehicles. And maybe our solution is to sell miles, maybe. But we really want to understand what is happening here. And so therefore that the car companies, in my mind, understand that they have to figure out what the future beyond probably a 2030 long-term scenario is. But I also will say the numbers that we discussed earlier today, where we said, well, it can be a few percentages here, a few percentages there. The automotive industry, after all, is a very well-oiled machine. And if market shares just shift like a few percentages, that hurts quite some of them. So my take is they're very much aware of it. But I would not expect from the car companies or the oil companies to drive just the sustainable part. It's certainly due to many of their hearts who work at these companies, because after all, these are citizens of planet Earth as well. But in the end, I think it requires regulation, which I subsumize under infrastructure, because it will not happen by itself, I think. But the companies will be ready, I guess, once we need it. All right.
Hi there.
Hi.
I can speak up too, so it's not wrong.
Am I supposed to do this? Yeah, just speak up, and if not, then I can receive.
So Alejandro now with Emerald, I just presented before you, but so being part of the DOE, we cannot get too much into the policy or regulation, we don't get at all into it. But the more and more I do research about it, the more I realize the importance of policy and regulation. So I think you just touched on it, but I would like to know what are your thoughts on those, what cities can do in terms of those scenarios that we can talk about, the increase in sharing, the increase in pooling, the reducing deadheading, because you put a picture of solving this problem, which I agree with, on providing mobility for certain populations, reducing congestion, but it can actually do the opposite. We can actually, so in terms of, let's say, in a private versus shared use of a vehicle, what are the things that maybe cities are thinking, or even in Silicon Valley, like before we even do a lot of this testing? Look, the testing is great, we need it. But I think even more important is how do we set up a system that is towards those goals that you just mentioned, instead of being a pocket used for the wealthier, or even providing less autonomous vehicles with no occupants on it.
Yeah.
So I would like to see what are the discussions in Silicon Valley in regards to this. And at the same time, we don't want to deter the innovation and the moving along and the process that Silicon Valley is doing, but understanding that we want to move towards the positive. So.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, let's see. I mean, I'm going to give you a relatively fluffy answer. I want to be honest with you, which is it really has to start with communication. I mean, really, people and organizations talking to one another, because in my mind, there's really too much potential, or if you want to call it risk, that this goes wrong. And this is where I personally just don't believe these ideas or statistics. Look, with the autonomous and connected car, we will just dissolve all congestion and it will all be roses coming out of the exhaust pipe. And I don't believe these things. Because if we make something, including mobility, cheaper, safer, more convenient, more sustainable, then people use it less. I won't see this. So this is why we really need to have a conversation and probably put out some boundaries where we say, look, in this city, this kind of transportation is regulated in exactly this way. And it might be that neighboring cities put out different kinds of regulation, because the lay of the land might be different. For instance, San Francisco is obviously surrounded by water on 3 sides. Sacramento is relatively different, and also population obviously is different and such. And I don't want to say it has to be taxation, because that is something that I observe here in the United States and in Europe equally much. If you put out taxations, you very often hurt the ones that are maybe less fortunate than others. Meaning, if someone basically just wants to pay to get into London, someone can afford it to just drive into London. If someone really has a minimum wage job, probably thinks twice if he or she can drive into London. I'm not sure if that's fair. So this is where we really need to think about mobility being, I would say, a basic human need almost. I'm not saying mobility in a car, but really be able to go to places. We have to figure out what the solution for this is, and really, it's not just a public-private undertaking. It really takes many kinds of players. And I'm surprised these days how often I read headlines that some of these crowdsourced map companies and routing companies that put on your smartphone app, go here, go there, that they get a lot of heat from some of the rich communities in Silicon Valley. Like, this used to be like a sleepy, nice community, and now your app gets us all the traffic through our city. We don't like you anymore. So this is also what it shows us, just an app that says there's congestion on the freeway, you might want to take this route, and then you end up in somewhat congestion in somewhat formerly sleepy neighborhood. So just a very long way of giving you a fluffy answer, but it really is, it has to be this dialogue, and I think it's not something that we can just solve all preemptively, that we say this is how we should do it and therefore it will be all perfect. I think we have to learn step by step, and we also have to be open to admit mistakes. That's maybe then the best sense of Silicon Valley thinking, not learn from mistakes, but to really pivot and try something else. Otherwise, I don't answer because I do agree with you. It's not that we say, well, the traffic is all going to get better through these technologies. It might be to regenerate much more.
Hi, Sven.
Hi.
Can you hear me? No?
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, Sven. I'm Keith Seofis. I'm an independent consultant. First of all, I thought this was very nice, fantastic. I don't know.
Thank you.
I don't know what my comment would be, but it would go out there, but it was positive.
We'll discuss. Yeah.
Okay. What I didn't hear today at all, and maybe you could comment on this, was the potential rollout and impact of passenger drones on the mobility industry. Do you have any comments on that?
Passenger drones.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, companies working on it. Uber, Elevate, Airbus has their A3 labs in Silicon Valley. Much I understand, Boeing is working on those. I think just yesterday the International Air Show in Berlin, I think, finished, and it was one of the big three topics, passenger drones. Well, I'm not an aviation expert, and still looking at transportation in general, there's obviously all these questions like, can it be safe and how do you regulate it? At least a car you can stop on the side of the road. Depends what kind of flying object it is, but it can certainly not stop forever mid-air. So that needs to be figured out. It is probably for special applications. So what's discussed a lot in Silicon Valley is a route from San Francisco to San Jose, which probably many of you know, it's somewhat in the order of 80 miles or something like that, which can take you 2.5 hours on a bad day. And if you can do this with 3D traffic, that would get you there much faster. My general take on this is the concepts that we see today are very interesting concepts, but it might lead in the end to something else, which is more along the lines what I said earlier with the Amazon bookstore internet example.
Yeah.
Now, it really inspires the imagination. I mean, it's well known that some of the former Google autonomous driving people are now working at this company is called Kitty Hawk or something like this, which is supposed to be something similar. I'm really curious to see what it's going to be, but really for safety, for air regulation purposes, and also something, I mean, my town, Palo Alto, citizens complain about all the air traffic that we get from San Francisco Airport. That it's getting louder, and now we see always like these planes coming in, which has gone up by however many % over the last 10, 20 years, especially because of a lot of traffic from Asia, obviously. So now seeing all these drones, and with people in there will not be small drones, and will not be super quiet drones, I think, because they need to move air, and that causes some acoustics. Needs to be regulation, and it might be something completely different in the end, but will be part of the mix, I think. That's my best answer.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
My name is Peter Allen. I teach real estate city building here at U of M, and I'm curious, as you think about Palo Alto or Ann Arbor or any desirable place to live, and all the space that's now devoted to those roads and parking lots and parking decks. And as all of these things unfold, how we're going to redevelop our most favorable places to live. What's going to happen with those old spaces? How might they solve affordability problems, gentrification problems, open space opportunities? A sideline is that anytime a developer develops really desirable mixed-use, place-based development, the more they can put it to, next to a transit center, the more valuable it will be, because people can get rid of their car. So what do you think?
Yeah. I would definitely applaud more walkable cities, and I mean my last name is Beiker, and guess what? I am a biker. And so I, for instance, find that Boulder, Colorado is in my mind a pretty good example. I really enjoy the city, and they really did a great job, I find, in not just putting pedestrian areas, but also bike path and all of this. And I think it really takes these learnings. Why has it worked in some municipalities and not so much in others? And I think it certainly takes a lot of political will, if not courage, to implement these solutions. But typically we see that this makes cities more livable, and that it attracts then people, and that you can actually solve for the other transportation needs that one has as well. My personal opinion on this is, and I do say it as someone who considers himself part of the automotive industry, an automobile is just too easy to use. And it is, despite the fact that the automobile as a product is maybe the most regulated consumer product that you can imagine, the usage of the car is not that much regulated if you think about it. And therefore it's just too easy to say, well, we build a house, we have a 2-car garage, and we drive to work. As opposed to, if we build a new development there with whatever, 200 homes, how do we get these people to work? We let them buy a car. And that is just what I really find we as a society, and that is very often the same in Germany as well. We just don't really follow through. And we say, well, once we put like the houses and then gas and water and internet and a little road, we're done. I assume it needs to come to a situation where there's a general approach that goes with some sort of use tax and energy taxation or something like this. I'm not a political expert, which you can probably tell by my statement, but that's my statement as a citizen, what I would say. Okay.
Great.
Time's up. Thanks.
And we're just going to take a couple of minutes to switch out an SD card, right? SD card. And we'll collect right over here. We're going to put some mics on Sue so we can sit.